NIL Now with Lauren Sisler and Kevin Jones.
If you want to learn more about name, image, and likeness, you need to go to The Source. The NIL Now podcast from Headline Studio and Reddit highlights the biggest storylines with comments from key guests in the college and high school NIL space.
NIL is not a cherry on top. It needs to be thought about as a part of these young men and women's future to, further their careers. You should be able to leave college with something.
Subscribe to NIL Now on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Every year, thousands of human remains are found in the United States, and in one of every 4 instances, authorities can't identify the body. That's starting to change. I'm Dave Killen, co-host of The Unidentifieds, a new limited series podcast from the Oregonian and Oregon Live. We go deep into several cold cases and explain the science that's helping experts give these long-forgotten people their names back. Look for The Unidentifieds after you've finished listening to this podcast. Subscribe to The Unidentifieds on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome into a very special Thursday edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Mohammad Ahmad doing things solo today as Andrew Gillis and Mike Nizek have the day off, but I am not alone or solo completely because I have a and I'm going to keep saying very because she's a very special guest, and that is Dr. Laurens Steed from the University of Cincinnati's Linder College of Business. She is an assistant professor of management whose specialty is in leadership over at UC. Now, you might be wondering, why do we have a leadership professor on a football podcast? Well, I'll tell you why, because we've talked about Joe Burrow's numbers, Joe Burrow's background, Joe Burrow's stats, and what makes him, so effective compared to Patrick Mahomes, like all the jargon I could list for days and days, like we've been doing time and time again on this podcast. But people wonder, what makes him Joe Cool? What makes him Joe Shiesty? Why does he have all these nicknames? Why can he wear a SpongeBob sweatshirt and be cooler than some guy wearing a Versace suit for all we know? The point is, people ask, what makes Joe Cool Joe Cool? Well, the reason why I have Dr. Steed on here is to look at everything that makes Joe Burrow, everything that completes his personality, his leadership, his dedication, and everything that has allowed him to be one of the best players in the game right now and one of the best pro athletes all across major professional sports in America. Dr. Steed, I know that was a long introduction, but for a special guest, I think that's more than deserving. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. That was quite the introduction. It's always exciting to get to talk about organizational behavior, and super exciting to get to do it to talk about Joe Burrow as well. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I was telling our listeners this. We usually make Thursday our unofficial quote-unquote Joe Burrow day. So I said, okay, let's do something different. We've talked so much about Joe Burrow. I've done film reviews with our special contributor, Lance Reisland. We've talked about his stats compared to other guys, and we're even going to do more podcasts kind of comparing him to other quarterbacks like Josh Allen and Justin Herbert, and obviously – the contract extension stuff has taken up a lot of our time on this podcast, but I think this is really a nice change of pace, and I think it's going to kind of get people to really see the other side of Joe Burrow that people maybe don't see when it comes to, the non-physical, non-verbal side of things. So I guess to sort of start, Joe Burrow, I asked him before the AFC Championship game back in January, I said, Joe, if you kind of had to describe your leadership style, if you had to describe how you convey the message to your teammates, verbally or non-verbally, how do you describe it? And he said point blank, I've had this question answered, and I've had this question asked to me, and I don't know how to answer it. But the truth is, I think there is an answer. He just doesn't have it. So if you have to describe Joe Burrow's leadership style, what would you describe it as and why?
Well, so I would probably put Joe in the category of a transformational leader, using a transformational leadership style, which is what we in organizational behavior refer to a style of leadership where the leaders work to get their followers on board with a shared vision that they're motivating them to. They're looking to provide meaning to their work. They're serving as a charismatic role model that helps, direct them and influence them. And it also focuses on their development as individuals and followers. So in general, talking about transformational leadership, there's four main characteristics that we talk about. We call them the 4 I's sometimes. The first is idealized influence, which is often referred to just as charisma. So that's sort of the lay term that you often hear if you're familiar with charisma. Idealized influence has to do with having that innate kind of characteristic that we often associate with leaders. People want to follow the leader. They're charismatic. They you want to be associated with this person. And that's one that I don't know Joe. I should preface that. I've never been lucky enough to meet Joe, but I am a big Bengals fan, and I love keeping up with, how the Bengals are doing and watching press conferences and all that. So I've gotten to see some of the, behaviors and, quotes that Joe has said in press conferences, and a lot of them do align with a number of these styles. So if you want, I can talk about all 4, or we can talk about like specific characteristics, whichever you prefer.
No, I think that's a really good sort of bench point is you mentioned the 4 points. So you say the overall theme is transformational leadership, and the 4 points, which are, you said what, idealized influence, individualized consideration, and what are the other 2?
Intellectual stimulation and inspirational motivation. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, no, I think all of that makes sense. So I'm going to try to take a stab at these, and maybe you find some examples of what those 4 attributes are in relation to Burrow, and you kind of tell me if this makes sense. So you mentioned inspirational motivation. So would a good example of that basically be where he's convincing his teammates that hey, we are good enough to go to a Super Bowl. We are good enough to make it to the Super Bowl, which they've done? Or would you say that's more intellectual stimulation?
I'd say that's inspirational motivation. So inspirational motivation is really about getting followers on board with a shared vision for the future. And there's a ton of stuff that Joe has said that really, exemplifies this, right? That he truly believes that they're going to go to the Super Bowl. He expects to win, right? I think we talked about that quote that he said, earlier this year about how the window of winning the Super Bowl is his whole career, and that, winning division championships are the standard, right? They should be winning playoff games. He truly has made the kind of statements out in the press and put it out there that there's this big vision that he wants to align the team behind. And that's really a pretty good example of inspirational motivation.
Right. Just sort of saying the window is his entire career. That's sort of that inspirational motivation that, when he says that, they don't just hear it, they internalize it, they believe it, and that's what allowed them to make it to, back-to-back AFC championship games the last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, he really backs up what he says, right? That it seems like he doesn't just say things, he takes the action, he puts in the work, he does all of the things that the team sees him do to kind of line up to support that vision and that long-term goal. And some of that is his idealized influence in the way that he actually kind of gets team members really rallied along the goal because they believe that they can do it, seeing all of the other work that he's putting in.
I think that's very interesting, and I think there really is sort of something to be said about that because, I talked to Ted Karras after, they beat Tampa Bay in that crazy comeback win, and, the simple quote I took away from that was, when he talked about Burrow, he said he is our unquestioned leader, quote for quote. Mm-hmm. And, you hear that so many times from Joe Mixon, you hear it even from defensive guys like Sam Hubbard, who people call him the Joe Burrow of the defense, and I think there's a reason for that because Sam Hubbard is one of Joe Burrow's best friends because they went to Ohio State together before he went to LSU. And now that they're in Cincinnati together, it's almost like that sort of effect rubs off on him where it's like, yeah, it makes sense to call Sam Hubbard the Joe Burrow of the defense. Is that an example of sort of like that, I guess out of those 4 categories, where would you kind of put that? The way he kind of influences Sam Hubbard, is that also in that same category? Is that more maybe like an idealized influence?
Yeah, I'd probably call that one the idealized influence. He's got that charisma, just that generally people, this is, if you're talking about like the more innate characteristics or the personality characteristics, a lot of that falls into this category that people admire this person, they trust them, they respect them, they genuinely want to follow them and want to be associated with them. And I think that's sort of what you see if you're, talking about the Sam Hubbard being the Joe Burrow of the defense. In general, like there's a number of characteristics that Joe has that we know lead to effective leadership, or that Joe displays, at least, like high self-confidence. That helps the team not only have confidence in him, but trust, admire, respect him. And you see that kind of play out in the idealized influence as well.
I think another interesting example that I thought about is, the way that he took Jesse Bates on a vacation in Las Vegas last year, when Jesse Bates had his holdout because he didn't want to sign the franchise tender, because, he was trying to go for a long-term deal. And eventually he did sign the tender, and he played all of last year because, I think, due in part to the fact that Burrow took him to Vegas. They went to a UFC fight together. I think Chidobe Awuzie was even with them, so it wasn't just Burrow alone. But I think there were times where, like, it was just Burrow and Bates. And obviously we don't know what was said word for word. That's private conversation. But, like, assuming Burrow's words had an impact on Bates not sitting out last year and playing and helping the Bengals get to that point, like, do you think that qualifies with any of those characteristics you mentioned?
Yeah, I think that might fall in our individualized consideration category. That's really about focusing on helping individual followers achieve their potential, mentoring them, focusing on development. And you see that in that example. You see it in the way he talks a lot about focusing. So I just watched his press conference from this week. And he was talking about, getting to know each of the new members of the team, both who they were as players and who they were as people, so that he could kind of focus on building a culture within the locker room. And it was really down to the individual level. How can each person contribute? How can I get to know them? How can I help them kind of achieve their potential so we as a team can achieve our potential?
One thing that Zach Taylor said to that point, which I find interesting, is that, he said Joe Burrow's always been this way. It's not like he came in as a rookie in 2020 and then he got to this point. Like, Zach Taylor basically said, this is who they've known Joe Burrow to be. He even said that, like, if you were to talk to his high school coaches, Ed Orgeron, like his LSU coaches, they'd probably say the same thing. And I would imagine Coach O would agree, and whoever his coaches were, Urban Meyer at Ohio State, obviously would probably say, yeah, like, that's just how Joe Burrow's always been. So it's not like this sort of happened overnight. It seems like this has really been who he is for a lot of his life. But would you say he was just, we don't really know word for word, or we can't really get in his head, but would you say people with transformational leadership styles are born that way? Does it match their personality, or is it something that you think maybe he learned from his dad because his dad's a football coach, or his mom, or, do you think someone along the way might have had an impact on him? Like, do you think he's just been like that, or was it sort of a nature nurture thing where maybe he was kind of brought up like that in some sense?
It's definitely, I don't know, Joe, but in general, when we talk about this, there's aspects of both. So, there are personality characteristics that we know lead to being considered an effective leader. And some of those are innate, things that you're born with, or that tend to be pretty stable over the course of your life. Like your personality, whether you're extroverted, cognitive ability, kind of the way you handle and respond to stressful situations. A lot of those stay pretty stable over the course of your life. But a number of these others are behaviors that you can learn and model and see modeled and kind of continue to develop and grow. And I'm sure that there's aspects of his leadership that he has, figured out on the fly as he's led high school teams and led at LSU, and then now goes into, his latest season here in Cincinnati.
I think all of that is so interesting. And, now he goes into year 4 where he came in, he was the rookie, he was the new guy. Still the main face of the offense, obviously, but it's different when you're a rookie. Now you're in year 4. They're drafting guys that he probably doesn't know that well, that, like you mentioned, he's getting to know now, like Charlie Jones, Chase Brown, whereas, like, they drafted Jamar Chase, and that was a no-brainer because that's, like, one of his best friends, dating back to their time at LSU together when they had that big championship run with, that 2019 team. So, him bringing in these guys, welcoming them in, like, getting to know them, teaching them the offense. Would you say maybe it's a little bit different now that, like, he's got this experience under his belt? Like, maybe this is more of a coach question, but I think this kind of ties into the leadership aspect of like, now that he's established himself as one of the faces of the league, the absolute face of the franchise, do you think maybe he carries an even greater weight, or do you think there's really no change there going into year 4?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, the one thing about Joe that I think, or there's a lot of things that I admire about him, but he does seem to not take himself too seriously, or kind of get a big head about things. But he does also really talk a lot about learning and growth. You notice that in his press conferences now, after games, he's always talk about learning and developing and growing. Actually, I posted I used to use a Twitter for my class a lot. And in 2020, I posted a clip of him in his first season where he was getting talked to by some refs. He was mic'd up in the game, and they told him he needed to start committing to sliding so that he didn't get hurt. And he was like, I'm learning, I'm picking it up. So he's always kind of had that aspect that he's talked about since he's joined the NFL. And I think that there's probably some component of him that has this pretty stable skill set that he's confident in leading these teams. But I'm sure that he's continually, learning and growing as they, face each new season. And the expectations are certainly higher this year than, they've been in past years. So I'm sure he's kind of responding to that as well.
So that I know that clip you're talking about, and it's a hilarious clip. There was even one part where one of the Jaguars players dropped their wristband, and he was like, "This y'all's? What am I supposed to do with it?" Like,
Yeah.
it was just, like that's the thing. People would look at that and say, "Gosh, what a weirdo!" Like, who cares? It's someone's wristband. But like you said, he doesn't take himself too seriously. Like, is this yours? Is this yours?
Yeah,
Oh, well, what are you gonna do with it now? Like, it's just so casual.
there's so many great clips of him mic'd up like that. There's one, where he's introducing himself to other players on the other team. Like, they don't know who he is. And he's just, mid game. I can't remember who he's introducing himself to, but he's just like, hi, I'm Joe. Like, we all know who you are.
That was the
Great.
Super Bowl when he went up to Von Miller and said, "Hey Von, I'm Joe. Nice to meet you." He went up to Aaron Donald, who walked right past him because obviously Aaron Donald's trying to win a championship. He goes, "What up, Aaron?" And he kind of pats him on the head. And then I think he saw Eric Weddle and said, "Hey Eric, I'm Joe. Good to meet you." And it's like, you're playing in the biggest football game in the world. Like, I think they know who you are. They've watched a lot of film on you. I'm sure they knew who you were before you were even a pro. And so he obviously knows that. Like, I think he really doesn't take himself that seriously. He knows it, but I think that leads to kind of the second area of leadership that I think is interesting with Burrow is that I feel like it's like a sense of interpersonal attractiveness. Like, the fact that he just says, "Hi, my name is Joe," even though the whole world knows you're Joseph Lee Burrow. Like, I mean, how do you sort of describe that? Like, is interpersonal attractiveness a good way to kind of talk about why Joe Burrow just doesn't take himself too seriously, and why maybe that actually gets a lot of people interested in him and attracted to him?
Yeah, I think he definitely has just a general, there's just a general aspect of liking with him that I think makes him he's very approachable, and he seems pretty genuine. He seems to be the same person. And, at least the situations that I see him in, I don't know what he's like behind the scenes or in the locker room, but I think people respect that genuineness, and respond to it. And he seems like he likes to, have a good time and focus on having positive relationships. Like, I just saw the Jamar Chase thing where he was talking about him doing like UFC fighting, maneuvers on him in the locker room or whatever. He seems to have like a general
up on him.
Yeah. Just a general, there seems to be a genuine amount of liking for between him and his colleagues or his teammates, the people that he is trying to lead. I think that's an important part of building trust and having people respect you, is that they have to, at least there has to be some level of, respect for who you are and liking who you are. And I think he definitely does seem to project that.
I think that's a good turning point for the next part of our conversation, where we talk about everything you mentioned there, the respect, the attractiveness, the camaraderie, and the emotional side of that. When we come back, we're going to break down all of that and more. Again, this is Dr. Laurens Steed, an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati Linder College of Business, who specializes in leadership. Don't go away. We'll have that segment when we come back right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. All right, thanks for staying with us on this very special edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Laurens Steed from the University of Cincinnati Lindner College of Business. And the reason why she's here is because she has a specialization in leadership, and we are breaking down Joe Burrow's leadership and what makes him so effective on and off the field. Before the break, we were talking about everything involving sort of his transformational leadership style, and we pivoted into that sort of interpersonal attractiveness. You know, you talk about him shaking hands with players on the field as if they don't know who he is, but he's clearly one of the faces of the league at this point. And then, you know, he sneaks up on Jamar Chase doing UFC like fly kicks or whatever the moves are, which, by the way, that would be so funny. Like, I was joking on the podcast earlier this week. That'd be so funny if you put him in the ring with Jamar Chase in like a UFC setting. Like, I would love to see who wins that fight, because that would sell more than any of these other fights. I don't know who fights who, but like I'd pay my whole bank account savings to watch that, because that would be hilarious. But like, that's the thing is, I think it's very hard, you know, not just I think with what he does as a quarterback, but in most fields where you're the center of attention and you have to lead the way. I think it's very difficult to, you know, find that balance of really being serious, really getting people to be on the same page, but being so likable that, like, you know, you're not goofy, but you're also so likable that people want to listen to you and they want to be with you. Kind of talk more about that. Like, is Joe Burrow maybe so unique in the sense that, without speaking too much for other players, or I guess other quarterbacks, that he's almost mastered the art of like being so approachable that you can talk to him about anything, but so serious that like you don't want to let him down?
You know, yeah, I don't know. I can't really speak for many other quarterbacks. But he does seem like he's done a nice job kind of walking that tightrope of being likable, but also, you know, being serious about the work that he's doing as a quarterback, and being serious about what the Bengals are doing and the goals that they have set as a team. And I think some of that is that you kind of see him in his press conferences, at least, move back and forth. So he'll make a lighthearted comment or a joke about something, but he really doesn't seem to, he seems to take the conversations about what they're doing on the field, their strategy, you know, his play, his game, very seriously. He seems to speak very seriously about that. And so I think he at least in what he projects outward, again, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes. He seems to do a good job of, you know, when for the serious topics, you know, approaching those with the gravity that shows he does take them very seriously. And when he can be lighthearted, you know, he does build that in.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting because, you know, sometimes you look at him like on the field, like when you look at the TV cameras and, you know, like the in-game broadcast, like he seems almost emotionless, but he's really not. I think that's just a sign that he's very, very locked in. And then you kind of look at things like, you know, away from the field when, you know, he kind of lets his guard down and has fun, like in the locker room, sometimes even in post-game press conferences, like where he talked about the Super Bowl window being his whole career, you know, like the cigars and wearing like Jamar Chase's national championship jersey before that game they played at the Superdome, which was, you know, their sort of homecoming in that sense. And then you look at just the celebration videos where like he's just having fun smoking cigars each time they clinch the AFC North, which I think leads to kind of the third and overall arching point is there's a sense of emotional stability where he can keep himself together. He can have fun, and he can really be so locked in that, like I said, you look at the TV cameras, you look at the shots, and it's like, does this guy not have any emotions? And he does, but it's just so calculated. He's so callous about it. Like, how do you sort of describe his emotional stability?
Yeah, so emotional stability is a personality characteristic that we study in my field in organizational behavior that has to do with being, you know, calm, collected, more even keeled, unlikely to kind of, you know, overreact at the sense of stressors. And you see that over and over with him, you know, in the way he on the field, they'll be down a ton and he never looks panicky. He always talks in his press conferences about, you know, we went back to the locker room. We didn't panic. We trusted our work. We knew that we could do this. You know, I saw like a quote from him from their early loss last season to the Steelers, where he threw a bunch of interceptions and he talked about never panicking in that situation. He just keeps it pretty calm, and he has seems to have a high level of tolerance for stress, which is something that we know from research can lead to effective leadership, because people are looking for that sense of calm, that we got this, we can stay even keeled, we can do this. And so he projects that outward very well, both on the field and after the field. You really never see him, getting super reactive one way or the other, which I think helps kind of create a sense of trust and respect for him.
Unlike someone like Tom Brady, for example, who you give him a Microsoft tablet after he throws an interception, and that tablet's going to be gone in like the next 5 seconds. Like, you just don't see that from Joe Burrow. And this is not a knock on Tom Brady, by the way. Obviously, he's earned a lot of the titles he has for his own right and his own reasons. But, I mean, you don't see that. You don't see that from Joe Burrow. Like, he might get upset. He might get frustrated. I think he told Tom Rinaldi in an interview once with ESPN when he was at LSU that one of his sort of character flaws, or one of his, like, I don't want to say flaw, maybe that's a strong word, but like one of his, I guess maybe flaws is the right word. One of the things that he knows he can get better at, I guess, is that like sometimes he tries not to get upset, but like little things will upset him. And it, in the interview kind of showed clips of him like just kind of getting mad after a bad pass or a bad throw. So it seems like maybe that's something that was never really an issue for him, but he zoomed in on it so much in college that it's almost like spotless in the NFL, where you can't see him getting mad. You can't see him getting upset. So could you maybe say that, like, whether it's that Steelers game, him telling everyone to take a deep breath after starting 0-2, like how much do you think by him doing that, aside from fans and stuff, obviously, more importantly, it allows like his teammates and everyone around him in the locker room to take a deep breath and calm down?
Oh, I think it does for sure. And he understands, I think, very much that he is setting the tone and he's setting the culture for how the team is operating, how the team is responding to adversity. I think it puts that trust with his team that we got this, we can do this. And I mean, you've seen it play out, right? They've had 2 fantastic seasons back to back. And I think a lot of that does come from them, maintaining, because they've had some real close games, and they did start, 0-2 last year. And they were able to project that calm. We got this, we've got the confidence, we can do it. And I think that's really important.
Obviously, I think a lot of pundits and critics, and even I think, even myself kind of said, like, how do you dig yourself out of an 0-2 hole? And then they go from that to being 5-4, or 4-4 after getting literally blown out in front of the entire country on Monday Night Football in Cleveland. I think a lot of people were saying, okay, Jamar Chase is out for the next few games. You just lost your Dobie Awuzie for the rest of the year. Your offensive line is questionable. Like, you still have those concerns you had from the year before when he got sacked a whole bunch of times. You got to deal with the Chiefs coming up. You got to deal with the Buccaneers coming up. Like, people were saying, like, can the Bengals really pull themselves together and make a run like last year? And a lot of people were very skeptical of it. And from that point on, they didn't lose until that AFC Championship, which obviously even then they barely lost that game. That came down to like essentially the final drive or two. So, is that almost like, I mean, Burrows is going to be confident in himself no matter what, like you said, but can he sort of kind of look at that and say, oh, look, I told you guys we were going to be fine and we're going to be fine? Like, does that only allow him to command even more leadership and respect amongst others around him?
I mean, I'm sure if you're a member of the team and you hear him saying, we're going to be fine and we got this and we're going to win, and then you're actually doing it, he's right. Of course that's going to lend some trust and some credibility to the things he's saying, right? He's not all talk. He's able to, you as a team are able to get it done. And that confidence is just, translating into actual wins in the season, which is awesome as a Bengals fan.
Right. Yeah. And especially if you're a Bengals player. So I think I'll kind of tie this all together and sort of spin it forward is, we just kind of laid out the framework of Joe Burrow's leadership style, the interpersonal attractiveness that makes him so likable, and the emotional stability that allows him to just take a deep breath and sort of tell everyone, hey, we got this. We're going to be okay. We're going to be good. Now that we sort of know this framework, and he's going into year 4, partially with his teammates from the last 3 years, like Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Joe Mixon, and then without some guys, like he doesn't have Hayden Hurst, he doesn't have Samaje Perine, but he has new guys on his team, like the rookies I mentioned, along with Irv Smith Jr., who's somewhat of a veteran, kind of like him. Now that he is navigating a new season with a similar but different look, whether it's next year or beyond next year, like the next decade, if he plays that long, however long he decides to play football, why are the Bengals going to benefit from his leadership style? I guess the first part of that, because I know that's kind of a broad question, as far as the first part of why they're going to benefit from that, how much more attractive does that make Cincinnati to other free agents who, need a team to play for? And maybe they're not even on offense. They could be defensive players like Nick Scott who need a home. And they might look at that team and say, hey, I want to play with Joe Burrow. I want to play for the Joe Burrow team. Like, how much of an impact do you think that has on changing the culture of bringing guys into Cincinnati?
Oh, I think that matters a ton. Isn't that what happened with Irv Smith?
To an extent, yeah, it was actually. To an extent. He said, he saw Joe Burrow and just, couldn't turn down the prospect of playing with him. Also, Hayden Hurst, same thing last year. He openly said after they beat the Bills that, at this time last year, or at that time last year, he was watching them on the Super Bowl thinking, I would love to be a part of an offense like that. So they've said that word for word, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it play out, but I think it matters a ton. It's just like in the workplace. That's my area of expertise. We want to work at organizations where we see this leadership that people can get behind and get excited about the mission of the organization. And it's really no different that this is these players, this is their job, right? And they're looking to find a workplace where they feel that they can do their best work and be supported and show off their talents. And, I think that Joe and the whole organization is projecting this sense of strategy and, leadership, and that this confidence that they're going to do it, and people are attracted to that.
I think that's the biggest thing is, you kind of spin it forward. It not only helps them internally with what they have right now, with the players they have right now, but it just allows them to be more marketable. Like, I think in a way, like Duke Tobin, the director of player personnel, said this, I think, before the draft, which was that, you look at people like Irv Smith coming for 1 year on a deal, Hayden Hurst 1 year on a deal. There's almost sort of like this confidence that Cincinnati has become this place where it's like, hey, you can come here and you can win with us. And if you come for just 1 year, you can become a marketable free agent to other teams. Like, that's what happened with Hayden Hurst. He came for a year. He proved it after some decent stints in Baltimore and Atlanta. And now he's the highest paid tight end right now with the Carolina Panthers.
Oh,
or at least he was the most highest paid tight end from this year's free agency class. I don't know if he's overall the highest paid. I think Travis Kelce might be it. I have to check the numbers. But the point is, he's making pretty good money. And all it took was 1 year with Joe Burrow. CJ Uzomah, he played a couple years with Joe Burrow. He got to play with him for 2 years, but 2 years was all he needed, and now he's at the New York Jets making pretty good money too. Like, who knows if that'll be the case with Irv Smith. If he has a good year, he stays healthy, maybe he goes somewhere else and makes a lot more money. So I know talked a lot about money there, but like, is that almost evidence or correlation that playing with Joe Burrow will allow you to be a better player? Not just like on the field, X's and O's, but just as a person, as far as like learning the game. Like, do you think he really teaches people how to win, not just on the field, but off the field?
Gosh, I have no idea. I wish I knew. I mean, I can
More of a coach question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a coach question. I mean, it does seem like it lets people really, when you're playing with someone at that skill level, it's letting people show off their talent, and they're getting to kind of develop levels of skill and talent that they may not have gotten to develop if they were, working with someone who maybe wasn't as talented as Joe Burrow, although all NFL quarterbacks do have a pretty high base level of talent. But yeah, I don't know like about that interpersonal development. So I guess that's probably more of a coach question.
Yeah, no, I think maybe that's a question for like the assistant coaches who work directly with like those players I mentioned. And actually, I do kind of want to ask them that because I do wonder, like, yeah, I mean, the on-field stuff is obvious, how well you can catch the ball and how well you can run her out, but like, like how much does someone like Joe Burrow like instill confidence in a guy to be able to do that, to be able to run her out, to be able to make a catch like that? I really think a coach would have an interesting perspective on that. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing about it is like, you sort of laid out the leadership framework, but then it just kind of spills into so many other areas that, you could do separate podcasts and separate discussions on, like, kind of what I mentioned there with what does it do to a guy off the field and his performance? What does it do for a guy in his confidence? But I think the general consensus is, Joe Burrow has changed the culture. By changing the culture, he's gotten players to buy in, and by players buying in and players wanting to buy in by coming to be a part of that culture, like in free agency, it really has made the Cincinnati Bengals a championship contender. And it's not to say that it's only because of Joe Burrow. You look at the players around him who have done what they've done, but it all goes back to him. A lot of their success goes back to him, especially, the receivers like Chase and Higgins who get the ball from him. Not that they couldn't do it with other quarterbacks, but it's definitely unique when Burrow gives it to them. So I know I'm getting into a lot of X's and O's now, but but Dr. Steed, this was a great conversation. It was very enlightening. And as a matter of fact, kind of a little sneak peek to our listeners, on Monday, I'm going to have a comprehensive story that analyzes and breaks down Joe Burrow's leadership, Joe Burrow's style, based on input from Dr. Steed and other experts and players and even coaches on why Joe Burrow is able to be so successful at what he does with his craft as a leader. So, Dr. Steed, I cannot thank you enough for your time. This was very insightful. And before I let you go, I want to remind our listeners to sign up for our Cincinnati Football Insider subtext service. Go to cleveland.com/Bengals. It's a 2-week free trial to get the best news, insight, and analysis from me, Mike Nizick, and Andrew Gillis. And if you want even more of our reporting in your inbox every morning, go to cleveland.com/newsletters. Sign up for the Strictly Stripes newsletter. It's free, and it only takes a few seconds to sign up. So make sure you sign up for those things to get all of those stories, including the great one I'm going to be writing on Monday. Dr. Steed, appreciate your time. You have a great rest of your evening, my friend.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Likewise. Once again, for myself and Dr. Steed, I'm Mohammad Ahmad. We will see you back here on Friday.